Coptic manuscripts and limitations. Last time we were looking at the Coptic language and its dialect. So if you can stand another spoonful of Coptic studies, that's all it'll take and we'll be through with this. Up until the end of the last century, scholars thought there were only 3 Coptic dialects. Remember, we're talking about Egypt. Coptic language and dialects have to do with Egypt. They thought there were only 3: Sahidic, Bohairic, and Fayumic. All right, over here. Sahidic, pretty easy, that one. Bohairic, and when I say the other one, Fayumic. I'll put a line there between Bohairic and Fayumic. This was probably the current view at the end of last century and the beginning of this century. So we're speaking of one language, the Coptic language, but we're not talking about just one dialect, several dialects: Sahidic, Bohairic, Fayumic. However, that's been revised because of new documents which were discovered, which have come to light in this century, so that we now have added on to Fayumic, we have added on to this a second and a third one, and these have become have come to be referred to as Middle Egyptian dialects. Middle Egyptian dialects, with Fayumic being one of those. The other two are Akhmimic and Sub-Akhmimic. Akhmimic and Sub-Akhmimic. So that we're talking about basically 5 dialects. 5 Coptic dialects. Manuscripts will exist in these 5, one family, the Coptic family of languages, but in these 5 subcategories of dialects: Sahidic, Bohairic, and then the 3 so-called Middle Egyptian or Middle Coptic dialects: Fayumic, Akhmimic, and Sub-Akhmimic. Okay, let's see. The chief 2, of course, are Sahidic and Bohairic. Now, what I want to do, I think most of you can see this. Here's Egypt down here. That's why I was writing over there, to keep out of the way. It's really easy to become confused over the designations Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Upper Egypt is Southern Egypt, and Lower Egypt is Northern Egypt. That's really, here's Lower Egypt. They even have it written out for you. Lower Egypt, and here Upper Egypt. Some of you can see that, others you see where we're talking about here. Thebes was the chief city that has to do with Southern Egypt, which is Upper Egypt, and Memphis is the chief city that has something to do in this era anyway. And here's Memphis mentioned, and here's Thebes mentioned right there. So we're going to be doing a lot of discussion, a lot of talk about Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. So when I say lower, then think up. And that moves us up here to the Nile Delta region. Whereas we're talking way down near the 4th or the 5th cataract of the Nile for Thebes and for Southern Egypt and for Upper Egypt. Now the Sahidic and the Bohairic are the 2 most important of these dialects here. Those are going to be the ones that we discuss first. That's where we have most of the vast majority of our manuscript evidence exists for these 2 families. Now, the reason I'm showing you all of this is I want you to think about something yourself. It's only rarely that I can really, in some studies like this, figure up a question to ask you, to address to you, that you can really think about, because you have the arsenal, the wherewithal to come up with the correct answer if you think a lot. Sahidic, to get ourselves accustomed to where they are, Sahidic is to the south, Bohairic is to the north, or Lower Egypt, and then down here, Upper Egypt. That's where these dialects were located. Sahidic located in Upper, Southern, Sabitic, Thebes, Egypt. Bohairic in Lower, Northern, Memphitic Egypt. Now, we discussed in the last teaching the possible origins of Christianity down here and what Coptic is all about and how it's just a progression, a further development of the hieroglyphic, hieratic, demotic script, where we take chiefly the Greek uncials and add 7 demotic characters and end up with our Coptic language. And then you have small variations that could be seen between, let's say, Sahidic and Bohairic, obviously between those, and particularly between those in the so-called Middle Egyptian of Fayyumic, Achmimic, and Sub-Achmimic. Okay, with regard to Sahidic and Bohairic, since these are our 2 chief dialects, and most of our manuscripts represent these 2 dialects, these 2 subcategories of the Coptic family, here's a question I wanted to ask. Which of these do you think originated first as far as the translation of the Scriptures? The New Testament, originally written in Greek, obviously. Now don't answer until you've thought about it. Say, can we answer? Well, certainly. Bohairic or Sahidic? Why? Alexandria? I thought you would say that, and you're using a point of reasoning that's working just to your disadvantage, though. Why did you say that? Because of the population being up here, Alexandria, that's where a lot of translation work is done there. And so what do they speak here in Alexandria? Greek. So why would you have a need for the translation of the Scriptures, since they are existing in Greek anyway? The one thing you're thinking of is what works against you. What about way down here? Greek's not down here. This is where Greek is, up here in Alexandria. Right there.
Aren't the Jews down lower in Egypt?
The Jews down lower in Egypt?
Or upper Egypt, actually.
Upper Egypt, but you mean lower in Egypt from our point of view? What are they speaking down there? Coptic. And of the Sahidic variety, I would assume. Well, see, that's a little interesting piece of reasoning. See how you can use what you knew to be true about Alexandria and everything, and that little line of evidence ends up making you make a mistake then. You see, the Scriptures are in Greek here. The New Testament's written in Greek. Everyone speaks Greek around here, particularly up here in Alexandria. The further we are removed from the center of Christianity at this time in Egypt, and this is up here in Alexandria then, the quicker the need will be, and the quicker the rise for the need of the translation of the Scriptures in the language of the people, the lingua franca of the people down here, the language of the common people down here. They're so far removed from Alexandria and from all of the culture. Thebes is an old, ancient city. Memphis, of course, is an old, ancient city, and neither one of these is up here as close to the Mediterranean as is the city of Alexandria. So you failed. You failed the question. And I wasn't trying to be tricky. I was trying to show you, though, how knowledge that you can have can lead you to a wrong conclusion. And you're so certain about, well, obviously, of course it would be up here first. But now you see, now wait a minute, it wouldn't be up there first. They wouldn't have the need as early as they would down south to get it right into the language of the people. So let's begin with Sahidic then. Let's begin with Sahidic, Southern Egypt, Upper Egypt, Thebes. Okay, at one time it was referred to as the Thebitic or the Thebaic script at one time. This is probably an older term. Now it's always referred to as Sahidic, but if you come across writings, it will be older, something like Thebaic or Thebitic. Thebaic, Thebitic, Sahidic, Southern Egypt, Upper Egypt, are all the same thing then as far as Coptic concerns. Thebaic, Thebitic, Sahidic, Southern, Upper. See how it becomes real confusing here. All has to do with this dialect down in the southern part of Egypt. It was thought to be, and this perhaps is still to be thought of as true, the literary language over all of Egypt before the introduction of Greek and before the introduction of Christianity. Possibly spoken up as far north as Lower Egypt. But gradually it came to be identified only with the southern or the upper part of the country of the Pharaohs. And I've said New Testament translations seem to have first been made in Sahidic because of the distance from Alexandria and thus from the Hellenized portions of Egypt. The Greek culture, you see, really wouldn't have spread any, further south than just right here. That's where Alexandria is. That's where the best place in Egypt is. You have all of the fertility of the Nile Delta, the mouth of the Nile, emptying into the Mediterranean Sea, the southeastern corner of the Mediterranean Sea, and that's where Greek culture basically stopped. Therefore, these people down here, the Copts, the indigenous people here, are not Greek people. They don't have a Greek background. We have Copts up here who mingle with the Greeks and end up with a Hellenized form of thought and Hellenized language, in that they eventually speak Greek. But being as far south as we are with Thebes and down in Upper Egypt, it just seems like it would have taken not nearly as long a period of time for the need to arise for the scriptures to be translated into the local dialect. These would have been less influenced by the Greek language and culture, and this is important whenever you study text types in the Coptic family. They would have been less influenced than those of the Bohairic group by Greek language and culture. Obviously, because the Bohairic dialect is right up there knocking on the door of Hellenized Alexandria. Till the 20th century, it was known only in scarce and partial fragments. We're talking about manuscript remains here. It seems to date back as early as the 3rd century. So here's a date we're putting on Sahidic Coptic. It seems to date back as early as the 3rd century A.D., when the scriptures were first translated. The New Testament, beginning with the Gospels and, of course, going onward from that. So we didn't have a lot to base any conclusions or decisions or much research upon until the spring of 1910. When some huge discoveries were made in Upper Egypt of manuscripts, most of which were in the Sahidic Coptic dialect, included biblical and extra-biblical material, we only being concerned with the former of those, and that, the biblical area, being represented by the following material. Fragments of Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, 1st and 2nd Samuel, Isaiah, those are the Old Testament works, Matthew, Mark, John, 14 epistles of Paul, 1st and 2nd Peter, and 1, 2, 3 John. Those are the books now from the Bible represented in extant Sahidic Coptic manuscripts. Generally they are fragments, maybe a piece of papyrus, maybe even something in codex form, maybe a leaf or a folio or something out of, or a quire out of a codex. So what we're saying about Sahidic then is because it's the earliest, and it's the earliest because it's further removed from Alexandria than Memphis or the Bohairic dialect, that makes it the most important as far as textual studies are concerned. And notice 3rd century, we're talking about, if we're talking about the 3rd century, we're talking about the 200s. Now we don't know exactly when, whether we're talking about early, mid, or late, but remember we were talking about Syriac manuscripts back as early maybe as the 1st quarter or 1st third, something like that, of the 200s as well. We're talking, or the 100s rather, we're talking about just 100 years removed from that. And so we're basically talking about maybe beyond Syriac, that's why we're discussing it next, the next language, the next receptor language into which portions of the New Testament will be translated. So it makes it not quite as important as Syriac because it's not the earliest, but it puts it right up there, almost on par with Syriac, quite a bit ahead of some of these other things that we'll be looking at in the future, because at least this dialect goes back this early. The others don't go back this early, but the Sahidic certainly does. Here are a couple of the manuscripts that represent the Sahidic dialect. The most famous of those is known as the Crosby Codex, C-R-O-S-B-Y, the Crosby Codex, which is a complete copy of 1 Peter. Complete copy of 1 Peter that dates from the 4th century. We have some scraps that go back to the 3rd century, but nothing of major importance. And it's housed at Ole Miss, the University of Mississippi. Surprise of surprises, those Southerners aren't that backwards after all. Anybody who studies Coptic has to have something on the ball. Secondly, the Bodmer Papyrus 23. Bodmer Papyrus 23 contains Isaiah 47 through 66:24. Isaiah 47:1 through 66:24. And it also dates from the 4th century. Then a third example here is the British Museum. British Museum number 7594. This is an unusual manuscript in that it has an unusual combination of biblical books represented. Here's what I mean by that. It has Deuteronomy, Jonah, and the book of Acts. That's a strange combination of books to have. Instead of having the Pentateuch, the minor prophets, or the early history of the church, you kind of have a representative from all three categories. Deuteronomy, Jonah, and Acts. It was published in April of 1912. It dates almost back to the 3rd century because it dates around AD 300. Therefore making it, of course, one of our oldest biblical manuscripts. That's fairly old. And here's a picture of that manuscript, and here's something of what Coptic looks like. Basically, it's going to look like Greek because it is made up of Greek uncials here. That's British Museum 7594. Deuteronomy, Jonah, and the book of Acts. Okay, that's all I'm going to give you as far as manuscripts are concerned with Sahidic. It's estimated, I said, that the translation work probably began in the 3rd century. It probably took until the 4th century to have the whole New Testament in existence, portions of the Old, and maybe all of the Old as well. And then here's an interesting statistic regarding Coptic manuscripts. Of the manuscripts extant in Coptic, more than a half of them are in the Sahidic dialect. More than a half of them are not in Bohairic, Fayumic, Achmemic, or Sub-Achmemic, but they are in the Sahidic dialect. It has a text type that seems to be similar to the Alexandrian text type, but that may not be original. In other words, way back when the work was first done, it may not have had the Alexandrian text type. But over a period of 50 to 100 years or so, it picked up the Alexandrian text type because of the influence of Alexandria. And as a result, the manuscripts that we have would reflect that, and they would not reflect the earlier since we don't have full manuscripts that go back that early. Okay, that covers Sahidic. That brings us into Bohairic. Bohairic. Now, I'll erase all this that had to do with Sahidic, and we'll just concern ourselves with this term here, Bohairic. So that's the same as Lower Egypt or Northern or Memphitic. or sometimes you'll see it Memphic. About the same number of names, I think, for Sahidic and Bohairic. So they're represented, first of all, by their chief current-day terms, Sahidic and Bohairic. Then by their old terms, the Thebitic and Memphitic, or Memphic and Thebaic, just different forms, variations of the old term, or by north-south, northern here and southern down here, or by the lower upper down here and lower up here. They go by those various designations, but we'll refer to them as Sahidic and Bohairic. So the old name was Memphitic or Memphic. That was probably last century. Manuscripts for Bohairic are rather plentiful, but until recently, I'm always saying that because of the fantastic increase in archaeological studies in the last century. Till recently, the earliest of the manuscripts known dated from the 9th century AD, which is just way too late to be really of any value at all as far as textual studies are concerned. There are about 100 known manuscripts, or fragments of them, representing Bohairic. The vast majority of them are of late origin, like 9th century, which caused some scholars last century to initially suggest that probably the dialect didn't originate until the 7th or 8th century. And so the 9th century would be an appropriate time to have manuscripts dating back to, or dating from that time. However, new discoveries have disproven that theory for the date of Bohairic. It goes much earlier than the 7th or 8th century. It's now estimated that Bohairic dialects and therefore translations go back as early as the late 4th century. The late 4th century. Particularly for the translations. The dialect probably goes, of course, earlier. Now we're back to the question we started off with. I'll just kind of rephrase in a different way and give you that answer plus another answer. Why do we have later manuscripts from this dialect as opposed to Sahidic? Well, an answer that we need to look at first of all is the climate and topography of Upper Egypt. Since Bohairic, we're saying, since Bohairic is where the chief center of population is, up here around Memphis, up here around Alexandria, up here in the Nile Delta, since Bohairic is the dialect that is spoken up here in Lower Egypt, up in the northern part, and this is where most of the people live, why is it that the manuscripts here are of a later date as far as their origin is concerned than what we have down here? Well, two reasons. We gave you one earlier, and I'll come back to that here in a moment. But first of all, because of the topography and because of the climate down here in Upper Egypt as opposed to Lower Egypt up here in the north. It's dry and it's sandy. You get up here in all this low-lying area with the Nile Delta, it can become very, very humid, which obviously would make the manuscripts deteriorate more rapidly than they would down south. So that's probably one reason why we have older manuscripts from the Sahidic dialect and not Bohairic, simply because the topography and the climate of upper southern Egypt is more suitable for the preservation of the manuscripts than in the northern region. And then we said, secondly, that Lower Egypt was so thoroughly Hellenized and Greek was so completely dominant that the need for translation would pop up earlier down south than it would up north. The Bohairic manuscripts show greater Greek influence than the Sahidic ones. Bohairic, just like Sahidic, has Old Testament and New Testament as well. The Old Testament was made from the Greek, so it's not a primary translation. It's not a version then. And it's suggested that it may have been made from this man, or this is what we would call, and I don't know if I even gave this, but I give you, we studied earlier Greek translations, Hesychius and Lucian. Those were two men who gave us ones maybe like around AD 300 or something. You don't remember? Hesychius or Hesychian. Maybe the Old Testament for Bohairic was really nothing but kind of a translation of the Hesychian recension. I think I gave you that. It was after LXX and after Aquila and after Theodotion and after Symmachus, and we just attached those. They both were martyred around 300 or 311, something like that. Both Lucius and the Lucian, therefore the Lucian text named after him, and Hesychius and the Hesychian text after him. So that probably is the origin for the Old Testament. Another interesting thing about Bohairic is that it remains the official ecclesiastical and liturgical dialect in the small Egyptian Christian minority Coptic church. That makes sense because of the locale of the population of the country. Eventually we're saying, although Sahidic came first in its translation work, it was needed first because of the Greek influence and because of the predominance and prevalence of Greek in Lower Egypt to the north and the Nile Delta. But just because it came earlier doesn't mean that it lasted longer. Bohairic ended up eventually superseding and therefore supplanting the Sahidic dialect. And that's probably why we have most later manuscripts from the Bohairic dialect as compared and contrasted with the Sahidic. So it remains the official ecclesiastical and liturgical dialect of the very, very small Coptic, Egyptian minority Christian Coptic church in Egypt. In other words, Sahidic is not used or not spoken anymore, only Bohairic. And we said before that the last of the Coptic speakers, I think, died in 1633. So it's not a living language, it's a dead language, but it's still used in the liturgy and still used by the priests. The oldest complete copy of the Gospels is housed at Oxford, and it dates 1173 A.D. Now that just shows you how late this is. I said most of our manuscripts from Bohairic, we have only some fragments that go back to 6th and 5th and maybe even 4th century, maybe late 4th century, maybe really none from the 4th century, the 6th and the 5th, most of them from the 9th and later than that. So of course here we're talking about the 12th century, the end of the 12th century, 1173. So of course that's so late that doesn't do textual critics and textual scholars much good because it's just too late. Too many variants will enter in. You're too far in time and history. You're too far removed in time and history from the autographs of the Greek from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and the other apostles. In 1958, what's known as Bodmer Papyrus number 3 was published. Which is probably the most famous, well definitely the most famous and most significant and important and earliest major representative of the Bohairic dialect of a canonical work. 1958, Bodmer Papyrus 3 was published, which is a rather complete copy of the Gospel of John. It's a rather complete copy of the Gospel of John. It is mutilated at the very beginning, but starting with chapter 4 on to the end, 21. We have a very, very good manuscript on our hands. The date for it may be early 5th century, maybe even late 4th century. You almost, as you'll see, and we just have still numerous languages at which to look, you almost have to kind of separate all of your languages and dialects and put a little notation above them of centuries to keep yourself oriented as far as centuries are concerned. Coptic, we're talking about 5 different dialects, and they might run from 3rd century way up to many centuries after that. So we think of Coptic then as starting from 3rd century and working its way on up. Well, of course that's true. But that's only because the dialects are different. So we have to think of dialects whenever we think of Coptic. We have to think of Sahidic as 3rd century, then Bohairic as 4th century. And we may, if we can date this to the late 4th century, and if we can, it's early 5th, which is essentially the same. We may have a very interesting and very good manuscript on our hands, just as far as Bohairic Coptic is concerned, because it would have to be so close to the original time and work of the translation. Of course, it's still, we're still talking about numerous centuries removed from the autographs of the apostles, so it's not important in that regard. It's just important in how closely it could represent the original work done in Bohairic. Okay, that leaves us in with Middle Egyptian. And here's where you'll find a lot of confusion. And I don't know, I guess it's over terminology, a choice of terms. Because it goes by a lot of different names, and sometimes you'll find Middle Egyptian actually listed as one of the dialects, so that you'll end up with something like Sahidic, Bohairic, Middle Egyptian, and Fayumic, something like that. I don't think that's the best way to go about it, though. I think what we should have is Middle Egyptian, and then have listed under that what really fits underneath that, such as that. Middle Egyptian, it gets its name Middle because it came somewhere between Lower and Upper, North and South, Sahidic, Bohairic, and Sahidic. And it comes later in history. The dialects and consequently and necessarily the translations in those dialects. Okay, and I think we gave these to you a moment ago, but we'll get them down again. Fayumic, Akhmimic, and sub-Akhmimic. Okay, let's start with Fayumic. Now, I'm almost going to have to end up contradicting myself just to explain something. The Fayum in Egypt, we may be way up north. With Fayumic, we're up further north than we are with Akhmimic or sub-Akhmimic. The Fayum in Egypt is generally this territory right here. In other words, it's on the western side of the Nile, but it's in Lower Egypt, it's up to the north. So we're up here in, what I'm saying is we're up here in Bohairic territory whenever we're talking about Fayumic, whenever we're talking about the Fayum. But maybe, we should be talking about as far down south as here, as far south as we can go in the Fayum. And you'll see the Fayum spelled numerous ways, with an I instead of a Y, with two I's, with one Y, with two Y's. Instead of, spelling it like we are, Fayumic, we're putting two Y's in there. But you can have one Y. Doesn't make really any difference. You could even, I think sometimes you'll see an I before that, between the A and the first Y. I guess just because they like to confuse people. The old name, remember all these have old names, Bashmur. So now we have Memphic, Memphitic, Thebaid, Bashmur as the old names for Sahidic, Bohairic, Fayumic, and then we still have to deal with Akhmimic and sub-Akhmimic. The old name was Bashmuric, from obviously a place, from a town that we really don't know where it was, but it probably was in the Fayum somewhere in that area, but where we don't exactly know. No complete book exists for Fayumic dialect, but John's Gospel comes the closest. All right, theological question for you now. Why is John always popping up here? Why is it John's Gospel seems to be? Pardon? Okay, what can we do with that point besides shoot it down? Okay, well, why are you saying later?
Because of when Revelation was written.
But I mean, why would we have it represented more often if it's later?
Circulated probably.
Seemed like
more. It would circulate more because it was later, and there were probably more Christians, so they were.
Well, doesn't it seem like we're reasoning backwards? Doesn't it seem like the earlier something comes, the more time it would have to circulate? The later something comes, the less time we would have for it to circulate. What?
Where's the island of Patmos?
Where's the island of Patmos? All right. That's where he thinks he's going to get his answer.
No, I'm just curious where's that.
Well, I don't know which one it is, but we'll say right here. And here we are down here. And then, of course, we've got, well, we don't know about where Luke is writing his. We kind of think we know about Mark's. Mark's is probably written right up here. Luke, we really don't know. Matthew's, we really don't know, but he's writing to a Jewish audience, so maybe he's writing somewhere down here. So if we're looking for proximity, maybe we're talking about Matthew then.
Something because it's Greek literary form, and also it's sounding sort of like Greek and dealing with Christ, dealing with Christ right off. Kind of
Okay.
more philosophical and Greek.
Okay, you're getting closer the longer you talk. You want to keep talking? I'll never get that back on the...
They said Hellenized is the Hellenized area.
Keep bringing it up more. All right, a little bit further. Right there. Okay, go ahead. I wasn't listening.
He said it was more Hellenized area, and it's not. It's more of a Greek, kind of more literary form.
There's no doubt about that. But I mean, Luke is comparable just as far as literary concerns. I think you're thinking of something besides literary.
Well, it deals with the deity of Christ.
Okay, it deals with the deity of Christ. But why would that pop up more often though? What what type of Christians do we have down here in Egypt?
Not the Gnostics are down there, but if it has to do with the deity of Christ, it'd be some kind of heresy that they come against.
So
So they use John's gospel more to come against that heresy, but I don't know what heresy is.
okay, so we have more of an unorthodox, more of a heretical reason then for John's gospel being used more often, popping up more often. That's what you're saying. You're guessing, but that's your guess. I want to make sure I understand your guess. Why? Why is John popping up? Do you read it more often than any other gospel? You enjoy it more than any other gospel?
I would say, yeah.
You say yeah.
More readable.
It's more readable. Well, of course there could be many guesses why, but John's gospel is just popping up everywhere, it seems like. I mean, up north, down south, if a gospel is going to be translated, a lot of it, whenever it concerns a gospel work, a lot of it can be seen to be done with John's gospel and not with the others. That's probably because of the mystical, the semi-mystical nature of John's gospel. It is much easier to pervert than Matthew, Mark, or Luke. This is kind of what you're talking about. It's what you're talking about. It's kind of what you're talking about with its literary. It's kind of strange. I mean, let's face the facts. It's kind of weird. In the beginning was the Logos. Okay, what in the world does that mean? And the Logos was with God. Okay, the cat was with the dog, and the cat was the dog, and the Logos was God. That's the first verse. That's what we're saying. In the beginning was the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. You're saying the cat was with the dog, and the cat was the dog. Oh, we could really do some things with that then. Think of the mystical notions, heretical notions we could end up with in statements like that. And what about this always saying, I am the door, I am the good shepherd, I am the light, I am the bread. It's the I am gospel. I am bread. He's not bread. He's not a shepherd. He's not a door. He's not light. Not light. This is light. This is light shining. He's not light. It's much easier to tamper with John's gospel. He gives you more material to turn into heresy than Matthew or Luke or Mark, who just give it straightforward as far as they're concerned, and you just pretty much translate it, and you can build some heresies on it, but not nearly as much as John's gospel. For instance, let's open up John while we've got plenty of time. We're never in a hurry, even when we're in a hurry. We could just about go anywhere. And I mean that literally, anywhere. We're in John 1. In the beginning was the Word. And that never should have been translated word. It should have been left as logos. That's just a transliteration then. It's just Greek. But logos says a lot more than just word. In the beginning was the logos, and the logos was with God, and the logos was God. Same chapter, the last verse. Verily, verily, I say unto you, hereafter. Now, he's just come on Nathanael here. You know, Nathanael has this remark, can any good thing come out of Nazareth? And Jesus said, well, I saw you when you were under the fig tree. And we don't know exactly what he means by that because John doesn't fill in all the details here, but it must have been something rather significant because it impressed Nathanael so much, he comes across with, verse 49, thou art the Son of God, the King of Israel, and you confess that on a man just because he said, I saw you under the fig tree? He said, you're the Son of God. What does that mean then? You ever notice that here? That's interesting. He just says, I saw you when thou wast under the fig tree. And so, okay, fig tree, Israel, that represents Israel, doesn't it? So somehow we get some meanings out of this that maybe John never intended. Maybe he did, though. What does John mean by all of this terminology here? Doesn't the fig tree represent Israel in Scripture? I saw you under the fig tree. Nathanael then says, because of that statement, I'm convinced you're God's son. And so Jesus goes on to say, because I said this, do you believe? He said, you're going to see greater things than this. Verily, verily, I say unto you, hereafter you'll see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man. When did that ever happen in John's Gospel? When did Nathanael ever see the angels ascending or descending on Jesus? No record of that in John's Gospel. So what does he mean here? All of John 2. Why does John take up 11 whole verses telling us about a drunken marriage feast here? And the one who encouraged more wine to be there was Jesus, who worked a miracle. You could get some wine bibbers out of that in a hurry. And what about this chapter 3 here? Man has to be born again. Nicodemus says, how can I enter into my mother's womb the second time? See, everyone's misunderstanding everything he says here in John's Gospel. And I skipped over 2. It's just nothing but a misunderstood gospel. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up. 46 years they've been working on this temple. Will you, one man, build it in 3 days? Misunderstanding. Next verse, John says, I've got the correct understanding now. I didn't have it necessarily back then. He spake of the temple of his body. When therefore he was risen from the dead, then his disciples remembered he had said this unto them, and they believed the scripture and the word which Jesus had said. Chapter 4, he comes to this woman and says, I'll give you a drink. And he says, you'll never be thirsty again. She says, Lord, evermore give me that drink. She don't want to come back to the well every day. He said, but I'm not talking about that type. I'm talking about a type of water that will spring up into a well of everlasting life from inside you. Well, now she's confused. So he says, go call your husband. She says, I don't have one. He said, that's right. And you've had 5, and the one you're living with now is not yours. She says, you've got to be a prophet. Catching the train of thought here in John. We're just working chapter by chapter. Chapter 5, verses 25 through 29. Now, that's interesting along there. It's all marvel not. It's this business of the dead shall hear the voice of the Son of God, and they that hear shall live. Well, what's he talking about there? Is he talking about spiritual life? Is he talking about a literal bodily resurrection, or resurrection in one's spiritual nature and spiritual understanding? Of course, John chapter 6 is probably the best known of the misunderstood passages in John. Except ye eat the flesh, I'm in verse 53, of the Son of Man, and drink his blood, ye have no life in you. So all they can think of is cannibalism here. They said in verse 60, it's a hard saying, who can hear it? Many of his disciples went back and walked no more with him, remember. I'm over to chapter 7, and verse 8. Now, in the first 7 verses here, his brothers have come to him and said, well, anyone who does, miracles and things shouldn't be doing it in secret. Up here in Galilee, no one notices what's going on here in Galilee. You should be doing this down in Jerusalem. So they said, go to the feast. There's going to have a feast. They're going to be having the feast there, tabernacles. Go down there and show yourself. So he says, verse 8, he's talking to his brothers, you go up unto this feast. I go not up, and hey, it's been added into the text. It shouldn't be there. I go not up unto this feast, for my time is not yet full come. Okay, verse 10. So when his brethren were gone, then he went up to the feast. So he lied. He said he wasn't going up. So someone had to help us out and put yet in there. Verse 8 to deal with the lie that we have, skipping from verse 8 to verse 10. We'll cover that in ethics, by the way. Part of that thesis that I wrote dealt with this scripture right here in this passage. Then what about you thought you knew about verses 37 and to 39 in John 7? If any man thirst, let him come unto me and drink. He that believeth on me, as the scripture hath said, out of his belly shall flow rivers of living water. Where's a single verse in the Old Testament that said out of a man's belly will flow rivers of living water? You might have a few KJV cross references there, and you can check them out, and they won't say that, though. Yet he said, as the scripture has said. Then, of course, we've got the little textual problem in John 5, verses 3 and 4, as well as the one over here in chapter 8. And see, there's just no end to this. And then what about in chapter 8 and verse 14? Just showing you a few of these places where we're having problems here. John chapter 8 and verse 14, though I bear record of myself, yet my record is true. For I know whence I came and whither I go, but ye cannot tell whence I come and whither I go. However, if you'll turn back to chapter 5 and verse 31, if I bear witness of myself, my witness is not true. John 5:31. If I bear witness of myself, my witness is not true. John 8:14. If I bear record of myself, my record is true. So it doesn't take a lot of study. We're not even studying. We're just what we call flipping. We're just flipping the pages here. And I just look down. I don't have this in my notes. Just look down and look at all these problems and these contradictions and the mystical notions that we have here in John's Gospel. And what about him being called over there in chapter 10? We've looked at this one time earlier. Over here in chapter 10, he's called a good shepherd, and he's called the door. Now, you can't be both of those. If we're trying to have some figure or analogy or picture here of a sheepfold, we know what type of door we have here, and the good shepherd. How can you be both of those, both the shepherd and the door? Lots of problems. So that basically is probably the answer. We're way back here on Phiumic Coptic dialects here and manuscripts, but that's probably the basic answer. Why John is popping up. I said no complete book exists for Phiumic, but John comes the closest. We're having John many times because his book is much easier to pervert than would be the other Gospels. And here we have Michigan manuscript 3521. Michigan 3521. A lot of these are at Ann Arbor. A lot of the early manuscripts are at University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. John chapter 6, verse 11 through chapter 15 and verse 10. That's the best manuscript we have representing Phiumic. And it dates from the 4th century. Probably around the same time as Bohairic. However, in its textual affinities, it is closer to Sahidic than it is to Bohairic. It's closer to Sahidic than it is Bohairic. Okay, we come to our next one. 2 more and we'll be through. It's abbreviated these. I've already spelled them for you once. Akhmimic. Named after an old city, Akhmin, which again we're not for sure where, but somewhere in this territory. Akhmimic. Very, very few manuscript remains at all. What we have represents some of Matthew, Luke, Galatians, James, and Jude. Matthew, Luke, Galatians, James, and Jude. Again, maybe we're talking about the 4th century. Sub-Akhmimic. Very few remains. What we have is almost a complete copy of the Gospel of John. That is now in the library of the British and Foreign Bible Society. It came from an ancient monastery near the pyramids. So, of course, it's John again. There's no agreement on these last 2 dialects, Akhmimic and Sub-Akhmimic, as far as dates are concerned. I guess we're maybe being a little too free, but we're giving them 4th century dates. Probably Sub-Akhmimic, the 4th century as well. Okay, let's look at a few limitations of the Coptic language for being a good receptor language for the Greek New Testament. This is all very brief because it's very technical. First of all, we have a problem of tenses. The tenses are not the same. I won't always do this because it doesn't mean a lot to you unless you know something at least about Greek. And if you know nothing about that or about Sub-Akhmimic, then it doesn't really do any good at all. But a problem of tenses. We have, secondly, unfamiliarity of certain Greek words in Egypt, so that in the New Testament they're replaced by better known Greek terms. That is, in the mind of the copyist there. Therefore, we have the problem of what we've been looking at in Christian ethics of bleeding over from one term to another term. And probably the most important thing about the Coptic dialects, they have no case endings. It is a language of strict word order. See, if you know anything about case endings, if you've got case endings, I mean, you still have some type of sentence order that is generally practiced. But as long as you have your correct case endings on your words, it doesn't matter if the subject comes in the place of the object or the indirect object, or the verb comes before the subject or whatever. It doesn't matter. As long as you've got your case endings, we can tell. Are we talking about genitive? Is it accusative? Is it dative? Is it a command? Is it ablative? Is it the subject? Is it the direct object? Well, we don't have any problems there as long as we know what the case endings are. This is not true here. We have a language of strict word order, where the words have to fit in this order: verb, subject, object, indirect object, then adverb. Of course, you have other parts of speech, but those are some of the chief ones, and that's the order they have to go in. Verb, subject, object, indirect object, and adverb. Okay, that leaves us one final thing: abbreviations. One final thing: abbreviations. Okay, obviously we'd have to have a COP. Okay, Sahidic. What would Sahidic be? SA. Bohairic. Fayumic. Fay. Akhmimic. Subakhmimic. Coptic Sahidic, SA, we have our little raised superscript SA. Bohairic is COP, and a raised BO. Fayumic COP, a raised FAY. Akhmimic is a raised ACH. Subakhmimic, a raised ACH, and then a raised tooth. Centuries, I think we've already given you. Third, fourth, fourth, fourth. And on the left-hand side, we give you the EAPCR description. Okay, for Sahidic, we have EAPCR. All of them are represented. Bohairic, the same thing. Fayumic, the same thing. Akhmimic, we have E because we may have Matthew and Luke represented. We've got P because we've got Galatians. We've got C because we have Jude. And then for subakhmimic, we're going to have to leave it with an E because we have an almost complete copy of John.